Hello and welcome to 5 Tricks with Drum Buss. Okay, today we're going to be working with Drum Buss, and Drum Buss is a new effect in Ableton Live 10, and it's essentially an all-in-one drum bus processing device. So it's got some distortion, it's got some compression, it's got some overdrive built in, it's got a nice boom enhancer for kicks, and yeah, it has a dry wet knob, and it's got a transient shaper and a nice little output stage. You can do some pretty interesting stuff with Drum Buss, and this is just 5 simple tricks that I figured out with it that I use all the time, and I hope you enjoy it. We're here in Ableton, and this is the drum break that I've built at the moment. So you can hear it's pretty typical kind of drum break. I'm pretty happy with it as it is, but let's use Drum Buss to further enhance it. So the first trick that we're going to go over is Transient Control. What we're interested in here is this transient knob. So we'll turn it all the way to the left and we'll have a listen to what that does. So compared to this, you can hear it's pulled out all of that background reverb sound. We're just left with the individual hits of the drums. And if we flip it to the other side, you can hear that we're getting way more of that roomy vibe, all of that extra reverb tail, and all of the long sustained portions of the sounds. So I'll show you what this looks like in Smexoscope. So in the center, we essentially have the original sound. So it is a little bit different because of some clipping, but it's essentially the same thing. As we pull the dial to the left, we get less of the sustained portion of the sound, and we kind of focus more on the attack of the drums. So you can see that there's gaps between all of our drums now. And if I turn it on and off so that you can see the difference, you can actually visually see how much more present the attack portions of the sounds are. So moving to the left really accentuates the attack portion of the sound and reduces the sustain of the sound. Now this time, if we start at the middle and we move to the right, so you can see that we're still accentuating the attack portion of the sound a little bit, but at the same time, we're bringing up the sustain portion of the sound. So overall, we get an increase in perceived volume, but we're definitely accentuating the attack portion of the sound a little bit stronger than the sustain. So that's the first trick, transient control, knowing what that transient shaper does and how to apply it. So if you want your sounds to be longer and to overall sound a little bit more vibey and have more room, then you want to turn it to the right. If you want your sounds to be sharper and have higher attack, turn it to the left. Now you can also use transient control on individual sounds. Let's just chuck it on this snare to start with. So you can hear that that snare is still very dry and very short. What if we turn it to the right so that the snare extends? So you can hear that we've pushed the levels up a little bit. We'll bring them down to match. So you can hear that we've matched the volumes here a little bit, but the actual length of the snare hit is now longer because we've accentuated both the attack and the sustain. You can use this transient knob on individual drum hits as well as on your actual drum bus. Okay, so the second trick that I use Drum Buss for is overall vibe control. So this is essentially just about distortion and the overall tone of the drums. So I'll play our loop with vibe control off, and then I'll play it with vibe control on, and you'll be able to hear just the overall difference to the character of the sound. So there's a slight perceived volume difference, but the actual usable volume has come down. And this is possibly a little bit too extreme, but we can also use the dry wet to blend it in. So if we start at 0% wet, So even though we're only using less than 30% of this in the actual mix, you can still hear it's really changed the vibe of the drums. Rather than being very short and sharp and staccato, they're actually kind of a bit roomy, and there's a little bit of distortion, a little bit of crunch going on. And to me, it sounds great. So this vibe control kind of idea is just about using the built-in distortions and maybe the dry wet to get just the right kind of level of crunch and bite that you want out of your drums. You can take it too far, and we'll do that now. So you can see that I'm using a fair bit of drive, a bit of crunch, the hard distortion type, a bit of compression. I'm pushing the sustain portion of the drums, and this sounds way too blown up and compressed and distorted. But if we blend that right in, so maybe about there. So again, just a subtle amount of even too much distortion and too much crazy stuff going on gives the drums some really interesting vibes. That's why I call that technique vibe control. Okay, so our third trick is not too much of a trick, but you can actually use Drum Buss as a clipper. And I do this if I already have a Drum Buss available, like I'm already using it on a track. I'll quite often use the built-in saturation and clipping to get the outcome that I want. So if we open some Mixoscope, this is our drum loop as it is. And I definitely know that this drum loop could do with some clipping because the snares are just a little bit too pokey and the kicks could, be shaved off a little. So let's turn on this drum bus. Now you can see that's way too much clipping, but if we balance this just right, so now that we've boosted this by only 3 and a bit dB, we've got a much louder overall drum break. We don't have too much apparent clipping, although the kick could do with some work. And we haven't needed to use a different effect to do that. And of course, we can push this effect really hard to get some interesting tones out of it. So you can see there that it's just clipping the levels, and I'm using this utility to bring the levels down 9 dB on the other side, just so it's not absolutely deafening. So that's pushing into the limit pusher by 35 dB, which is a fair bit. And it is breaking up and it is sounding distorted, but sometimes when you want clipping, Drum Buss is a really acceptable way to get there. All right, so the fourth trick is a built-in part of Drum Buss that we haven't looked at yet, which is this boom and frequency and decay knobs. What I've used this for is to enhance a kick. So I've got this kick. I'll turn off Drum Buss entirely. You can hear it's okay. It's got some nice room to it, but the bottom end is just a bit flabby. If we have a look at the waveform, you can see there's some low frequency stuff, but it doesn't really settle into a note except maybe here. So it could do with just a bit of enhancement. Drum Buss has that built in, which is what this boom knob does. Usually it's at 0. We'll wind it up to 100% to get this dialed in. We'll put the decay at 100% as well. I'm going to put it at the maximum so you should be able to hear it on any speakers. So you can hear that the kick happens and there's this resonant boom at 90 Hertz. Let's bring that down. We'll try and tune it. So I think about there is about right. So that's almost an A sharp. Let's... And so what I'm listening for in order to know that that's the right pitch is that I can hear the phase interference if I'm just slightly out. So remember that it's on 57.2. If we bring it up a little bit, you can hear a little bit of wobble in the low frequency sound. If we bring it up further, you can hear that boo-woo, and that's phase interference happening between the resonance and the actual held note of the kick. You can hear kind of a wobble there. It's almost an audible pitch at the very start of the sound. When the kick is still happening, you can hear this inside the bass note. If we bring that back down to 57, so you can hear it at the very start there goes boo-woo. So it's close, and 57.2 sounded perfect to me before. I was still a little bit off. Yeah, so right there, I can't hear any phase interference going on between the resonance and the kick. So that's probably about the right resonant pitch. So if we wanted to use this kick in our drum loop, so what I've done now is I've switched off our original kick and I've got our new kick here, and we can hear that mixed in with our loop. So it sounds good, but it's way too long. That's exactly what this decay knob is for. So if we wanted to, we could now sequence this out because it's much shorter. So I'll now play our enhanced kick and then I'll turn off the drum bus so you'll be able to hear the difference. So now the enhanced resonant tone might be a little bit too much, and that's what the boom knob is for. So it controls basically the level of the resonance or the amount of the resonance that's making that tone. So you can hear the drum bus making that kick sound a lot nicer overall, and the boom enhancement is giving a much cleaner kind of sub note at the very bottom. So the last trick is something that I don't think maybe many people have thought of, but I quite often use drum bus for bass processing. It's got all the components that I want for some sort of bass processing. And in this case, I'll play the original sound and then I'll switch on the bass processor that I've dialed in. So we got like a short staccato 303 type sound initially, and then we're using the overdrive and the crunch and the transient shaper to bring out some extra overtones. And we're essentially just using it like a distortion with the added benefit of a transient shaper. So you can make the bass kind of vary in its overall texture with the transient shaper. And then these drive and crunch knobs are really handy for giving extra kind of flavor to the distortion. And of course you can use the dry wet knob to just blend that in if you want to. So it's a really interesting way to get some extra processing. So there you go. Drum bus can also be used to process bass lines. And I'm not sure that a lot of people are doing that, but I think it has really interesting applications. And it encourages you to do some interesting stuff to bass lines, which you might not necessarily think about if you're thinking about processing a bass. Using a drum tool on a bass line is going to give you an interesting result. So that's it for 5 tricks with drum bus. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And remember, this project file will be up on my Patreon. And yeah, follow me on the socials and I'll see you in the next one.